Ethan Kross, author of the international bestseller Chatter, The Voice in Our Head, Why It Matters and How to Harness It, is one of the world's leading experts on emotion regulation. An award-winning professor in the University of Michigan's top-ranked psychology department and its Ross School of Business. He studies how the conversations people have with themselves impact their health, performance, decisions, and relationships. Ethan was born and raised in Brooklyn and attended the University of Pennsylvania, where he was elected Phi Beta Kappa and graduated magna cum laude. After earning his Ph.D. in psychology from Columbia University, he completed a postdoc fellowship in social affective neuroscience to learn about the neural systems that support self-control. He moved to Michigan in 2008, where he founded the Emotion and Self-Control Laboratory. Joining him, a dear friend and very special person to fan, Heidi Stevens, is a Chicago-based writer and the creative director of Parent Nation, an initiative of the University of Chicago's TMW Center for Early Learning and Public Health, which works to provide parents, caregivers, and communities the knowledge and tools to optimize foundational brain development in all children. Prior to joining the U of C, Heidi worked at the Chicago Tribune for 23 years, where she wrote a daily column called Balancing Act, which is now, missed a page, which is now a nationally syndicated weekly column. Heidi has served on the FAN Board of Directors since September of 2021. It is my deep pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Ethan Kross and Heidi Stevens to the stage.
Thanks for coming, and thank you for hosting me.
Thank you for coming, and thank you all for coming. This is such a good turnout on a Tuesday night in March, and it's chilly out, right? What the heck, it was so warm this morning.
I think it could be worse, though, no?
It could be so much worse. Yeah. It could be so much worse. And you've been here all day, right? Here at North Shore?
Yeah, we started, Lonnie, what time did we start? 4 a.m. prepping for this? We started at 4. We had a lovely morning. We started off with a presentation to all the students, sixth grade to 12th grade, and they were fantastic. Who here are parents of students? Okay, you should be really proud, because these students were totally engaged and asking questions, and it was a really rewarding experience. So thanks for raising them and coming here as well.
That's wonderful. So the book starts out, and I'm hoping that you can start the discussion tonight out with the story of your grandmother. And
yeah.
Her story is woven throughout the book, but maybe just start by telling the audience a little bit about your grandmother.
Sure. So my grandmother, her name was Dora Kremn, and she grew up in a small town in eastern Poland, and in many ways lived an idyllic life growing up. Small town life, like really rich community relationships, had a large family. And when she was in her early 20s, the Nazis came into town on motorcycles, and in a very short period of time proceeded to just turn her life upside down. She saw her family and friends basically be slaughtered right in front of her eyes. She very narrowly escaped that fate herself. Her boyfriend at the time, who then became her husband, my grandfather, essentially bribed one of the officers to let her go. She was on a line to be killed. And they then had this kind of Spielbergian experience, moving from ghetto to ghetto, living with partisans in the frozen Polish woods for years. Ultimately survived, moved to the States, started a family. My mother was a part of that family. And I had an exceptionally close relationship with her growing up, because I would spend every day after school with her. While my parents were working, she would watch me and feed me. She loved feeding me, like too much food, and not healthy food either. My grandfather was a tailor, which made it really problematic, because she would just give me more food as he would like let my pants out. So it
was a business model.
Yeah. In any case, I digress. But so here's the deal with my grandmother, and the reason I start the book with her. All I wanted to know growing up was how she survived. She was this heroic figure in my mind, and I wanted to know, like, Bubby, how did you do it? Why did you do this? And whenever I'd ask her those questions, she would deflect. She would say, don't ask why, just go eat or go ride your bike. And she would actually have this phrase she was fond of, why is a crooked letter. Is anyone familiar with that phrase? Why? It's kind of deep for someone who barely spoke English, right? Like, why is a crooked letter? In other words, there's no good that comes from asking that question. And so, as I mentioned to the students this morning, a great way for all of you parents to ensure that your kids do something is to tell them not to do that thing. And she told me not to ask why, and I ended up spending my life doing precisely that. So thank you, Bubby. And that's how I launched into the book.
Well, and there was a rare but exceptional exception to that, right? Once a year, she would talk about it, and she would talk about it very publicly, and she would tap into her emotions while she was talking about it publicly. So talk about that.
Yeah, so, when I went back to reflect on her story, what I realized is she would not voluntarily speak about this experience. She moved on with her life and had a happy life full of joy, except for one day a year, she and her fellow survivors would organize this grassroots Remembrance Day event, and during that day, the emotions would just fly. And I would sit there, I'd always go begrudgingly, because I never wanted to go as a kid, but in retrospect, I value it. I would hear the stories I was always craving that one time a year. But then she would go back to clamming up and not talking about it. So it was kind of like what she was doing was dosing the negativity. She was saving it for this day. Or if she happened to bump into another survivor in the grocery store and they brought it up, then she would do it. But that was it. And that experience is really powerful for me because I think it's evidence, and fortunately we have a lot of data to support this now too, that this idea that you should never, ever, ever avoid your emotions, which is baked into our culture, that is a myth. Chronically avoiding our emotions can, in fact, and is harmful. If all you do whenever you are triggered is you repress, you deny, you just push it aside, you never come back to it, not good. But we have made that observation and overgeneralized from it to say any form of avoidance is bad. Actually, being strategic in how we divert our attention can be really, really good. So let me ask you, have you ever gotten an email that provoked you and found,
Never.
Yes? Never.
Sorry.
You're looking at Lonnie when you say that. I wonder what's going on over there.
I'm sort of known for the hate mail I get.
Okay.
Just for context, but yeah, I've gotten emails that provoke.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I didn't know that. Do you ever take some time away and then come back to choose how to respond?
100%. Yeah, absolutely.
That is strategic avoidance right there. And that's one tool among dozens that I want to have in my toolbox.
Right. Well, to watch your grandmother be able to access what she was feeling, but then also compartmentalize it, right? So it wasn't an either or. She had both skills.
That's right. She was flexible, and flexibility is really one take-home of this book, that you want to be flexible in your ability to draw different tools from your toolbox, depending on the needs that you have in a given situation.
Yeah, I want to go into that a lot more. Before we do that, this was fascinating to me at the beginning of the book. I think there's sort of a notion or a feeling that emotions, or certainly the quest to have mastery over our emotions, is relatively new. But there's evidence dating back thousands and thousands of years that you write about, of approaches that we took, not always very healthy or wise approaches.
Yes.
To dealing with our emotions, or even, getting some relief from our emotions. So it's not new at all. It's really goes back to as long as mankind. So
Yeah.
a little bit about that, because I think that's an important context for this
Yeah.
conversation. This is not some new agey, like let's
No.
all admit that we have emotions. Like emotions have been sort of mastering and conquering us for thousands of years.
Yeah, I think we've been struggling to manage our emotions for as long as we've been roaming the planet in our present form. And just to give you some evidence of that, if you turn the clock back 8 to 10,000 years ago, our ancestors invented what is widely believed to be the first surgical technique. Any guesses here if you didn't read the book yet? Anyone want to gauge your medical history knowledge? Yeah, there you go. Hole in your head. Let's get this. They have a couple of. They have this. Okay, you get 5 extra books for that. Thank you. Lonnie, she left. Lonnie, she's going to kick me out soon. So trepanation was the name of this technique. It involved carving holes in people's skulls while they were still alive, we believe. And one of the reasons why this technique was believed to be used was to help people deal with big, dysregulated emotional states. Now, if you think back 8 to 10,000 years ago, before we had sophisticated experimental paradigms and theories of emotion, if someone is acting really emotional and outlandish, then maybe there's something inside you, maybe a demon that is causing these problems. We need to let that force out. So that's why we think this technique came onto the scene. But there's so that was 8 to 10,000 years ago. Then let's switch to the ancient publishing world. What is the best-selling book of all time? The Bible. What is one of the most famous stories of the Bible? The story of Adam and Eve. It's a story of temptation and the failure to regulate our emotions. So we've been struggling with this kind of these kinds of issues for a really, really long time. And the great news is that no one's like giving demos on skull carving tonight.
Right.
Like we're not passing around ice picks. Right? Like the lobotomy, an emotion regulation intervention. Everyone know what the lobotomy is? Did you also know that the inventor of the lobotomy won the Nobel Prize for that invention? That's right. You can look it up. Fact check me. Nobel Prize for an emotion regulation intervention, 1949. That, I think, just puts in perspective how much we've been struggling with these issues and how thirsty we've been for solutions.
Right, and I think also important context is why it's a struggle worth pursuing and continuing. And you cite in the book all sorts of evidence of how much better we do when we can regulate our emotions, right? In our careers, in our finances, people's organs age more slowly when they can regulate their emotions, right? And also that they're malleable, and our ability to regulate our emotions is malleable. So talk about why that's important, right? That we're works in progress on this. We're not fixed or broken.
So I think about emotion regulation as, I like to use the phrase emotional fitness, and in many ways I think the metaphor of physical health applies really well. So if you let's say you were motivated to get in shape and be healthy, if I just told you to do that and you didn't know how to use any of the equipment in the gym, you might be somewhat successful, but you're not going to be nearly as successful as if you learn different routines, different ways of integrating exercises into your life. I think the same is true when it comes to managing our emotions. We're born into this world experiencing emotions. Does anyone want to dispute that idea? Anyone been in the delivery room with a child? That is an emotional creature, right? But we don't receive a user's manual that tells us how to manage those different states. And so as a result, we end up stumbling through life searching for ways of doing so. And I think we stumble on some solutions that work for us. Our culture gives us answers that sometimes are correct, other times may not be so helpful. For example, this notion that avoidance is always harmful. I think we need to be a lot more nuanced than that. A lot of people here are probably familiar with the idea that you should really try to be in the moment as much as possible. Yeah? Some heads? Well, being in the moment can be great at times, but so can traveling in time in our minds to help us manage our emotions. And I'll give you one example of that. When I'm experiencing something that seems really big and big and really challenging to deal with, I will get into my trusty mental time travel machine, and you all have one too, and I'll program it up to go back to 1943, Aishishuk, Poland. And I get out of that mental time travel machine, I spend a few minutes with my grandmother and grandfather. That's all the time I need to spend with them for my perspective to be broadened, for me to realize that what I am going through now, as difficult as it is, pales in comparison to what they've dealt with. I've just used mental time travel to help me manage my emotions. I'm not being in the moment. And so that's just another example of culture leading us sometimes astray.
Yeah, I think another example that you bring up in the book that I thought was so fascinating was Matt, the Navy SEAL, and how he would use his emotions as signals, and not avoid them, but not necessarily be undone by them either. Talk a little bit about his mastery of emotions. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, so Matt Mazdam is this interesting guy. What I've learned from Matt is you just never know who your neighbors are. So I actually talked to some of your kids about this earlier today. So Matt and Laura live about 2 blocks down the street from me in Ann Arbor. And if you saw them walking down the street with their kids, you'd think this is just another loving family. They are a loving family. But Matt also happens to be a former Navy SEAL / Navy SEAL instructor / Harvard Kennedy School graduate / carried the nuclear football for President Obama. You guys know what the nuclear football is? It's the suitcase that can blow up the world. Like, he's in charge of making sure no one gets it. And when I started getting to know Matt and I interviewed him for the book, I said, well, what's a secret to your success? And without hesitation, he says, it's 90% neck up. What do you mean? He's like, Ethan, can you run a 7-minute mile? I go, yeah, well, I wouldn't enjoy it, but I could do it. Well, you have what it takes physically to be a Navy SEAL. What distinguished him from all the other people was his ability not to silence his emotions, as common stereotypes suggest of people in his industry. It was his ability to use his emotions as a tool. So when he experienced a little anxiety, he leans into that response. He recognizes that that's telling him that there's something important he needs to pay attention to and prepare for. If he experiences anger, he knows that his view of the world has been violated and there's something he can do to fix the situation. So he uses his emotions, all of them, as tools. And that is something that we can all do. And I will say that lots of people that I have come in touch with while talking about this book over the past 6 months, they are guided by the assumption that if they experience a negative emotion, there's something that they're doing wrong, because life should be free of negative emotions in the ideal state. I fundamentally disagree with that interpretation. I think if you are experiencing negative emotions, there is nothing wrong with you. There is everything right with you. I value the negative emotions I experience. What I don't value is when those negative emotions get tweaked too loudly or last too long. And that's precisely what shifting is all about. Being able to turn the volume on our emotions up or down, or shorten or lengthen how long they last.
Yeah, so to experience all of the emotions, to learn from all of the emotions, but to be able to sort of seamlessly shift in and out of them in an appropriate way so that you can...
Yeah. I mean, I genuinely view, this is going to seem maybe a little bit outlandish, but I value the fact that I can experience anxiety at times. When I think about the times in my career where I've given a presentation that I haven't really stuck the landing, I haven't nailed it. When I go back and I think about those moments, they were the presentations when I didn't experience any anxiety before. As a result, I didn't prepare for it. So when I feel those butterflies beginning to flutter, I'm like, all right, time to get to work.
Yeah.
And I value that.
Yeah. It's reminding me a little bit about the part in your book where you say what my grandmother had in common with Dennis Rodman.
They both could slam dunk that basketball really well. My grandmother at 4'10 3/4 was a menace on the floor.
Tell everyone what your grandmother had in common with Dennis
Rodman. So,
besides the slam dunk.
So Dennis Rodman, we all familiar with Dennis Rodman? So he was this exceptional Chicago, at one point in his career, Chicago basketball player. And interestingly, so when he was on the court, he gave it all. But what he would also do is take time away from the court. So there was this one stretch where the Bulls were competing in the postseason, and he left the team to go do some outlandish things, and then he came back, and he had a wonderful game where he put up these great statistics, and the Bulls ended up winning. His coach recognized that for Rodman to be successful, he needed that release valve. He needed to get some avoidance and then come back fresh. And that's precisely what my grandmother benefited from too. So she would not go there. She would not talk to me about the war, but then she would come back to it when she had to, or when she wanted to, like during the Remembrance Day ceremony. So they both benefited from this kind of dosing of the emotion, getting away from it and coming back. And I want to be very clear, that was a style of regulating that worked for them. One of the real ahas that I've had in my career is based on the research discovering that there are no one-size-fits-all solutions for managing our emotions. If there's one take-home, well, that's not true. I hope there are like 3 take-homes I hope you take home. But one big one is that there are no one-size-fits-all solutions. Different tools work for different people. And we scientists can't yet prescribe the ideal combinations of tools for a given individual in a given situation. We're trying to do that now. But until we can get there, the real challenge is to learn about the tools and then start self-experimenting to figure out which ones work best for you.
Yeah. I want to stay on the Dennis Rodman and your grandmother tool for a second, though, because I think that a lot of us would think of, and I probably did myself before I read this in the book, the off-court sort of antics. And when he would disappear, he was in he would go to Vegas and be on benders, right? Like he wasn't in church for hiding out in, seminary. We would think of those antics as sort of a liability, right? Like imagine how great he would be if he would just focus. Like imagine how much better he could be. When in fact, it could have been a value add, right? Like maybe he was only so good because he had that escape valve. And so I think there's so many applications for that, for ourselves, a lot of people in here are parents, right? So, in a way, I think it can give us some permission to have some grace with ourselves or with our kids. Like maybe they need to not do their homework one night, or maybe they need to skip practice one night, or maybe they need an escape valve. And here we are thinking like, God, if he would just apply himself, he could be so much better. He could be so good. And it's like, or maybe he's as good as he is because he pulls back, right?
That's right. I'm a big fan of grace, giving ourselves grace, giving others grace as well. My wife has taught me a lot about this because I was raised when you have a problem, you address it right away. You nip it in the bud. You don't avoid. You kind of approach, resolve, move on. And, through parenting and is husbanding a word?
I think so.
Yeah, I've been accused of making up a few words on stage.
Well, Shakespeare made up words.
Yeah, so I think as you say them with confidence, it's okay. Okay, I'm going to take that association. Yeah. So My kids, when they were little, and sometimes they were, not behaving, and I would want to get to the bottom of the problem, but it was much more effective to let them kind of ride it out and come back later and then address the situation.
Sure.
And so that's an example of benefiting from this capacity to let things moderate a bit.
Mm-hmm.
If you're curious why this works, there's something that we call a psychological immune system that we all possess. And one feature of this immune system, we use this metaphor to describe our psychology, is time. All of you here have experienced millions of emotional reactions over the course of your life. We're feeling things 90% of the time that we're awake. So you've had all of these reactions, and most of them follow the same basic time course. And here's how it works. I'm going to air draw. So you ready? No whiteboard, but my professor's coming out. So you're navigating life, something happens, an emotion spikes, and then as time goes on, it eventually fades. Some emotions spike more intensely than others, some come down more quickly, but they all follow that basic time course. As time goes on, the emotions tend to fade. So when you take some time away from a triggered reaction, you're allowing time to temper the emotional response. So when you come back to the problem, it's often not as intense as it was when you started. There are exceptions to this rule, but a lot of our experiences follow that calculus. And if you know how that works, you can leverage this tool to deal with the situation more productively.
Yeah. And if you get to the point where you figure out how that works, there's sort of, I thought this was fascinating too, there's a side benefit of mastery of your emotions, which is the knowledge that you can master your emotions, right? Which sounds obvious, but talk a little bit about the snake intervention.
Yeah.
For people who are afraid of snakes and what they learned by overcoming their fear of snakes. Not just to stop fearing snakes, but what else?
Well, so there are these classic studies that I talk about in the book where you bring this legendary psychologist named Al Bandura, brought in these individuals who are phobic of snakes, and then put them through an intervention that ended with them having like snakes draped along their body in a short period of time. Anyone want to sign up for this? Yeah, me neither. But it worked. And one of the interesting observations that this psychologist had from these studies was that the participants who went through this intervention didn't just rid themselves of their snake phobia. By realizing that they were capable of conquering their fear of snakes, this gave them this sense of confidence that they could manage all sorts of turbulence, emotional turbulence in their lives. So he describes this as developing a sense of self-efficacy, this notion that I can actually do it. And that's a really important, I call it a master belief, because you can break down emotion regulation at its most simplest form as having two basic parts. Number one, motivation, right? Can I do it? Do I want to do it? And then number two, ability. Do I have the tools I need to master my emotions? You need both of those to be successful, and I'll walk you through really quickly why that is. Let's say I'm not motivated to manage my emotions because I don't think it's possible. Am I going to try to do it then? It's not logical, right? If I don't think I can do something, why would I waste any effort to try to do it? So let's say the opposite is true. I think I can manage my emotions and I want to. Okay, but how do I do it? I can be really motivated to get really strong, but if I go to the gym and I don't know how any of the equipment works, I could do things that aren't going to help me achieve that goal, might even harm me. So you really need to both have the motivation, the belief that you can do it, and the knowledge of the actual skills, the tools that you can recruit to help you achieve that goal. And that's what this book is all about.
Yeah, and the book has all sorts of strategies in it, and I don't mean to keep steering us away from the strategies because I think people should walk away with, with several.
totally.
Yeah, so let's dive into some more strategies. So you mentioned time travel, and your both and example just reminded me that one of the things you talk about is how important it is, or how useful it can be to visualize a future that you want. But you can't stop there, right? You have to also visualize the obstacles standing in the way of that future, right? Do I have that right?
You're talking about Whoop.
Am I talking about?
You're talking about Whoop,
oh, okay.
yeah. You're ready to whoop it up,
same.
okay?
Yeah, wish, obstacle.
You got it,
okay.
yeah. This woman read the book.
I read the book.
This is very clear. Thank you.
I read the book. It's a great book. But why is it important to visualize not just the future you want, but also what's standing in your way of that future?
Okay, so who here has ever experienced what we call the New Year's resolution dilemma, which is, December 31st, I'm going to go to the gym every day and lose 10 pounds in the next 2 months. And then January 2nd comes and you're gaining weight and not going to the gym. Hands up, please. Okay, a lot of you. So this is very common. And essentially, scientists have tried to figure out, why does this happen, right? And what can we do to help people achieve their goals? Because we're not so great at it. And so this is decades of research where scientists have pinpointed all the ways that we fail to follow through with our goals. And they've developed a framework to help insulate us from those problems. And it can be summarized with the acronym WOOP, W-O-O-P. And so let me walk you through it. So number one, is the W is the wish. Really simple. What's your goal? You kind of think that through, you write it out. Once you have your goals, I want to be more in control of my emotions rather than having them control me. Then we get to the first O, which is the outcome. What's going to happen if you achieve this goal? I want you to really visualize that and immerse yourself in thinking about that outcome. The whole point of this is to energize goal pursuit. We want to kind of really get you motivated to pursue this goal. All right, so now we've articulated clearly what the goal is. We've got you motivated. Now we get to the second O, which is the obstacle. Now we want you to think about, what are the personal obstacles that might get in the way of you achieving this goal? And that's really important, because sometimes people think about all the good that might come of going to the gym and losing 10 pounds or regulating their emotions and being placid, but they don't stop to think of what might stand in the way of that outcome. So now you've articulated the obstacle, which brings us to the P, which is a plan. But it's not an ordinary plan. It's what we call an if-then plan. Or if you want to geek out with me, an implementation intention. Let's not go there. So the plan takes the following form. If this obstacle happens, then, and you plug in your different tools that you're going to implement to deal with that obstacle. What following this framework does for you is it makes goal pursuit automatic. So when you find yourself in a situation where you're not following through with your intentions, you don't have to stop and think, what should I do? You've already gained it out in your head, so you know exactly what to do. Now, what I find so interesting about this framework that I've just described, this is a science-based framework. It's been used in lots of different applications with kids as young as first grade to older folks for helping them achieve all sorts of goals. When I was talking with Matt, the Navy SEAL, I was explaining this framework to him, and Matt tells me the SEALs do something very, very similar before every one of their engagements. They sit around in a meeting room, they think about what's their objective, what do they hope to accomplish, and then they identify the different ways things may go south, the different obstacles that might occur. And for every obstacle that they list, they come up with not just one plan, but like 6 plans. And then they all make sure they're aware of these different contingencies. They go around Socratic style to make sure everyone is dialed in. So it's a wonderful real-world illustration of the value of this simple framework that everyone here can try if they're so motivated.
Yeah. One of the strategies I liked, because it seems so simple, is the way we self-talk, and to swap out I with you. So like, instead of I feel anxious, to talk to yourself like an outsider, like, you feel anxious.
Yeah.
You know, or instead of I can do this, it's you can do this.
Yeah.
Why is that powerful?
Well, first I'd love to know, does anyone ever do this seemingly weird thing where they sometimes talk to themselves, either silently or out loud? You can admit it, safe space. With your name or you, show of hands, put them up.
Like third person.
Yeah, you weirdos, what is going on here? Like, oh, I'll tell you what's going on. So, who here is a lot better at giving advice to other people than following their own advice? Let's see it, hypocrites. Put your hands up. This is a truism, right? There's a name for that phenomenon. It's called Solomon's paradox, named after the Bible's King Solomon. This is a very wise individual historically, but made terrible decisions when it came to his own life. We all suffer from this at times. When you use the word you to address yourself, this is a word that we almost exclusively use when we think about and refer to other people. So when you use it to address yourself, you're using language to virtually automatically shift your perspective, right? I'm like, Ethan, what are you doing? It's like I'm talking to someone else. Now, I don't know about you, but I say things to myself sometimes that I would never say to one of my friends when they're trying to deal with adversity. I probably wouldn't even say it to one of my worst enemies, sometimes what I say to myself. I'm always pretty motivating and encouraging when I'm talking to someone else. And so when you use you or even your name to coach yourself through a problem, it's shifting your perspective. It's putting you into this kind of coaching mode, which can make it easier to work through problems.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. Okay, so if our goal is to tune into all of our emotions, the negative ones, the positive ones, and sort of find a way to use them to our advantage, tune into them and master them, not let them master us. I'm curious if there has been a decade or an era or a time in which we did that pretty well. Is there an era where we sort of got it right?
Managing our emotions.
Yeah, where we didn't sort of over-pathologize, or over-avoid, or...
Yeah, I'm not aware of one. I mean, it's a fantastic question. In some ways, it's a really hard question to answer because we haven't been recording our collective emotional states the same way historically. Mm-hmm. So, there's a lot of discussion now about how depression and anxiety rates are moving in all the wrong directions, and that's absolutely true when you look at the data. But there are other factors I think we need to consider when interpreting those results. For example, there have been major cultural shifts in how we think about emotion and our willingness and the appropriateness of talking about it. Mm-hmm. And so I think we are living through a time right now where it's never been more acceptable to be vulnerable about how we're feeling. I told a few, I forget who I told about this before, Lonnie, but it was someone, you can vouch for me. When I was 12 years old, my parents got divorced, and my mom insisted that I see a social worker just to talk about what was happening a few times. Mm-hmm. And the thought of going to a social worker, it made the divorce look like a trip to Toys R Us. A social worker. And finally I relented, only under pain of serious injury. You can never tell anyone that I'm gonna go speak to a social worker, because it was such a heavily stigmatized behavior back then when I was growing up. Now, kids talk about this freely, and panic and anxiety, it's part of the lexicon. And so our culture's embrace of this is so radically shifted. it's really hard to say whether we're doing worse or we're just talking about it more. And
Yeah. Similarly, are there cultures within or outside of the United States that do a decent job at this? And if so, what could we learn from them? And if not, then also interesting.
Culture is, so I talk about these different shifters, these categories of tools you can leverage to manage your emotions, and culture is the final shifter, and it's arguably the most powerful one. I think of culture as the air we breathe. It's all around us, and it's shaping our values and beliefs. Like, what do we think emotions are for? Are they good or for us? Or are they bad for us? And it's giving us practices to manage those emotions. And you can look around the world and history and find cultures that have really provided us with tools to help us manage our emotions. Various Eastern cultures, Buddhism, for example, Hinduism, have really emphasized the importance of managing our minds to help people live more adaptive lives. Meditation, mindfulness, tried and true tools have emerged from those traditions. Religion is a really interesting example of a culture that gives us tools to manage our emotions. Mm-hmm. Rituals, prayer, can be really, really helpful for allowing people to manage their emotions. Some of the biggest challenges we face come from contemplating uncertainty and the unknown. And what's one of the big ones there? Right? Like, what happens when we pass away or people we love pass away? Religions give us answers to those questions and things to do when people that leave this planet go, like mourning rituals. So religions can be a form of culture that helps us as well.
Yeah. Okay, my final question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. Is this work that we're ever done with?
Well, I hope so. I think there's a moonshot effort that we can take to really try to solve this puzzle of emotion dysregulation. Do I think we're ever going to be perfectly calibrated? No. Do I think we can really move the needle on emotional suffering on this planet? Absolutely. We have learned a great deal through science about tools that people can use to help themselves and help other people. But in many ways, I think we've just begun to scratch the surface. And so with more resources, I think we can absolutely make major, major progress.
Mm-hmm. Good, that's hopeful.
Yeah. Well, thanks for all these great questions. And now I think it's time for more questions.